The only thing I can say to him is that, okay, I can't use a PCR test to see whether you have COVID or not. So I will drop that test down and maybe I will go for the antibody test. That's the thing. So even if he gets some sort of result, positive or negative result, and I find out the PCR test is flawed, the PCR test is not reliable, I can't directly say that therefore that person doesn't have COVID or that therefore that person has COVID in any way. All that would show me is that the PCR test is not the right test to know whether they have COVID or not. I will have to use some other test. But you were asking about what if we one day realize that the Kalam Cosmological Argument is flawed. Maybe one of the premises is false, or the logic doesn't hold. Or what if that happens for the moral argument or the fine-tuning argument? So here what something that I starkly realized from the works of Dr. Craig is that if one day we realize that these arguments don't hold, it doesn't follow that therefore God doesn't exist. All it follows is that these arguments can't be used to prove God's existence. Why? Because these are flawed arguments. And let me clarify that with an example, and then Pish, you can interject and let me know if that makes sense. And I'm just going to think of a quick analogy to sort of explain what's happening. Let's think about the RT-PCR test. I mean, it's sort of like a household name, PCR testing now. So we have the PCR test and the, what is it called? I think it's called the antibody test. Is that the name for the other one?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, so let's call it the antibody test. I think it's the antibody test. So it's tests about your presence of COVID in the body, in the sense as in was COVID sometime there in your body, and also people don't actually rely on the antibody test much because it is not as accurate or as in depth as the PCR test. And if you've taken the vaccine also, it's said that the antibody test will show you that you are COVID positive, because you have the trace of the virus, all of that. Yeah. So let's say that we are all using the PCR test. I mean, so I'm sitting down. Okay, let's assume that I'm a frontline worker, and I'm sitting down to take a person's PCR test. And I take the PCR test. I put in the swab, and I'm about to put it into the glass vial. And a person comes in and says, "Hey, we just got a new information from the World Health Organization. A new research has found that PCR tests don't actually show us whether you have COVID or not. The test has a deep flaw in it. It's a deeply flawed test. So, there's no point in using it because it doesn't show you whether there is COVID or not." So at that point, I have the PCR test ready to go. I don't say to the person, "Look at that. You no longer have COVID." I can't say that. The only thing I can say to him is that, okay, I can't use a PCR test to see whether you have COVID or not. So I will drop that test down and maybe I will go for the antibody test. That's the thing. So even if he gets some sort of result, positive or negative result, and I find out the PCR test is flawed, the PCR test is not reliable, I can't directly say that therefore that person doesn't have COVID or that therefore that person has COVID in any way. All that would show me is that the PCR test is not the right test to know whether they have COVID or not. I will have to use some other test. So in the same way, if the Kalam Cosmological Argument is proved false, it doesn't tell us that the universe therefore doesn't have a cause. All that would tell us is that we can't use this argument to probe the question of whether the universe has a cause. There could be some other argument that will show us that the universe has a cause. Maybe something like the argument from contingency, which would go on to show that there are things that necessarily exist and there are things that depend on something else for existence. Now we'll be breaking it down the line when we look at arguments, and we could look at that and point out to say that the universe does not necessarily exist. It is something that could have existed and could not have existed. Therefore, its existence is dependent on something else, and therefore we can point towards a first cause, or the argument for first cause as put forward by Aquinas, if I recall right, where he points towards infinite regress and say that there must be a first cause. So in that same way, we could use different arguments to try and show that the universe has a first cause. And we have mentioned about this in the podcast when Cameron Bertuzzi on a show had a presentation of more than 100 arguments. There were many arguments under the cosmological argument pointing towards a cause behind the universe.